Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm getting ready for another Washington, D.C. trip like the one 2 weeks ago, except this time it's for a whole bunch of lobbying meetings instead of a workshop. There's no specific policy that I'm lobbying for. It's more about educating members of the new Congress and their staff about my trade association and our weird little business sector that helped save the world during the pandemic. I'm sure it'll be fine, but it's almost a 3-year gap from when I used to do this in person, and that gap has been pretty significant. Among other things, the new staffers keep coming in. They're younger relative to me, and the political scene has grown even more fraught. And I guess so much has gone on since February 28th, 2020, my last lobbying meetings down there, that I find myself wondering how different I am from that Gil. Or, more depressingly, how similar am I? How little has changed? Anyway, midlife crisis in the midst of a world-altering crisis is, it's a perfect seg into this week's show. So let's get to it. My guest this time is Paul B. Rainey, who has a fantastic graphic novel out now from Drawn and Quarterly called Why Don't You Love Me? It's a tough book to talk about for weird reasons. It opens on a very bleak domestic scene, this sort of absurdist comedy about a family in which the mother is withdrawing into depression and alcoholism, and the father is trying to keep things together, even though he can't remember his kids' names more often than not. He's on medical leave from his office job, but he doesn't have any recollection of what he does there, while his wife is convinced that they don't even know each other and that they're in some sort of Big Brother show that nobody told them about. And after that, it takes a turn for the much weirder and becomes this incredible testimony, I guess, to the choices we make and don't make, and the lives we find ourselves in middle age, and the ways we try to escape them and accommodate them at the same time. I can't tell you a lot more because there's a story-related twist in the middle of it that's pivotal to how you recontextualize the family scenes and what the book turns out to really be about. But I'll say that the characters' discoveries of one another and themselves is just utterly heartrending. And the ways in which they come to come to understand the world and their lives within it, I think will resonate with everybody who's ever looked around and, like David Byrne, asked, how did I get here? Also, the office scenes will fill you with deep dread and sympathy for anyone who's had to live through those episodes, because they are way too spot on for Paul to be making them up completely. I don't even know where I just don't want to tell you too much about this book outside of telling you it's great. Paul's visual style, his artwork, it's all black and white. It carries the story along without distraction or messiness. It really brings these people to life in well, in ways that, especially in the first half, as the wife is going through more or deeper depression, and then finds her ways out of it, you see her visually transform in certain ways that are just expertly done. And all that's a real challenge, because this book is 210 pages, with each page formatted like a Sunday comic strip, if you remember those. He makes it all work. The art works. You understand who everybody is, where they are in space, and what is happening to them and around them in this very familiar format of panel layout. And I got to read a bunch of Paul's earlier work to prep for this one, and seeing the progression and seeing just this pinnacle that he's reached, where his art and writing fuse so perfectly. It's this is a special book. So while I can't tell you too much about it without giving something important away, I can tell you that Why Don't You Love Me is a remarkable graphic novel by a talented artist. Now, I do quote most of it later in the episode, but I want to share with you the blurb. It's from the writer Neil Gaiman. It's the only thing on the back cover of this book, and it captures everything we can and can't talk about and what makes this book so special. So Neil wrote, "When I began to read Why Don't You Love Me, I thought it read like any number of slightly surrealistic, slightly vapid early 2000s stories that were basically the cartoonist way of telling you they hated everyone and everything. And then it came into focus, and it wasn't that thing at all. And then it came into focus again, uplifting and heartbreaking and, a word that I use sparingly, relevant. The kind of story leading to a last panel that's all pain and joy and delivers the whole thing. What a masterwork. To understand all is to forgive all." So for most people, that's going to be their entry point to this book. They're going to read this thing by Neil Gaiman and think, I should give that a shot. And he's right. You should. Why Don't You Love Me is a fantastic book. And I'm so glad that, I'm glad that Paul put in the 6 or 7 years to making it, and the Drawn and Quarterly has brought it to a wide audience. Anyway, go get Why Don't You Love Me? Here's Paul's bio from the book. Paul B. Rainey is a British cartoonist who has been making comics for decades. In 2015, his graphic novel, There's No Time Like the Present, was published by Escape Books. He has been a regular contributing cartoonist to Viz since 2013. His creations include Peter the Slow Eater, 14-year-old stand-up comedian, and Audrey Pemberton. He won the Observer Jonathan Cape Comica Graphic Short Story Prize in 2020 with the strip Similar to, But Not. In it, he recounts meeting Madonna in his local pub in 1985. It's really a great story. I'll have a link to that in the show notes for this one. He has written, drawn, and self-published many comics, including Pope Francis Goes to the Dentist, Journey into Indignity, and Gripe Night. His new book is Why Don't You Love Me? And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Paul B. Rainey. So tell me where Why Don't You Love Me began for you, and what it's like seeing it in this final, we'll say final edition. Those are two questions, but, dive in.
So, I had a day job for many years working for a bank, basically. It wasn't a branch, it was one of the head offices, and I got dumped in a job that was quite tedious. I had to stare at a board all day and just let someone know if something spiked. And so I sort of zoned out for a lot of it, and I think I was reading those Fantagraphic reprints of Peanuts that they did in hardback books that were designed by Seth.
Yeah.
And I thought, I've really got to do comics. Why am I doing this? And it occurred to me I wouldn't mind doing something like Peanuts, a daily, like a newspaper strip every day, and then a Sunday edition, a special Sunday edition, and then put it out online maybe. And I had an idea for something about that wasn't Charlie Brown's parents, but could be seen as Charlie Brown's parents going through a difficult divorce. And if you wanted to, you could, if I was clever about it, maybe interpret that on one level as why Charlie Brown is the way he is. And then the kids wouldn't appear in it. You just see adults, the sort of opposite of it. And, and I liked that idea, but the problem was I was probably referring to real life people that I knew a bit too much for source material, so I couldn't really proceed with it. And then it sort of disappeared from my upper consciousness for a little while. And then it sort of resurfaced when I had other ideas for stories I wanted to do. I wasn't doing anything big at the time. This is around 2015. And so I realised that I couldn't do a daily strip, but I could probably manage a Sunday strip, given that I had work to do during the day. And so I sort of mashed up these various ideas and thoughts, and it became Why Don't You Love Me? I can't remember the other half of the question now, Gil. So
what it's like seeing it in this final hardcover edition after how many years was it? 6 or 7 years?
6 years for me to write and draw. I finished it 2 years ago at the start of 2021. It's just incredible. This is like the optimum object, when you're doing it. So it was originally serialized in Aces Weekly, which is David Lloyd's online comic, which, you pay to subscribe to. And then after that, I serialized it once a week on my social media. And I think some of the original artwork appeared in local artist exhibitions and stuff. So people were seeing it, but not necessarily seeing it all. They were seeing bits of it maybe. They were, they didn't know how seriously to take it or not. It's just something Paul does. Do you know what I mean? But this is the optimum object.
Trust me, based on doing this every single week, I understand exactly what you mean.
It's his little hobby.
Gil's got his thing. Yeah.
So it just feels like the optimum object, and it's everything's distilled down into a book. It's difficult to explain, but it feels quite like I've sicked up something from my perspective that's just what I wanted it to be.
I'm curious, how the story changed for you over time, but I'll ask first, serializing it and then collecting it like this, were there changes after? Were there, let me go back and fix X, Y, or Z? I'm using Z because you're not in the U.S.
Yeah, thank you.
I try and be polite.
No, I didn't change anything in the story when it came to be collected. There was I don't think I got any feedback in that area, really. I think we went through and there was sort of editorial things just to make sure that, my spelling's terrible, for example, and, that sorts of stuff, and that phraseology that may not have read particularly well was fixed, and phrases that might have been faulty, we sort of double checked those. Some of them were faulty and some were just English phrases that the Canadian publisher wasn't particularly familiar with, for example. But no, there wasn't any retrospective narrative fixing. I'm not averse to doing that, to be quite honest. My previous graphic novel, There's No Time Like the Present, had me doing some of that. But there's a point at which you have to sort of let things go as well. So, for example, in my first graphic novel, I drew lots of characters using mobile phones. And by the time, because it took me 8 years to finish that one, phones had changed. And I didn't
know if it was meant to be a retro thing that they were using old style flip phones.
I just went, I'm not fixing mobile phones because I will never finish this bloody thing. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I went, no, hopefully people just think I'm being kind of cool and ironic, In that book in particular, I would take it as a meta reference to
the fact that there's no time like the present, to me, really felt like it's about what it meant to be born before the internet.
Yes, it's absolutely. That was absolutely where I was coming from. Yeah, the other first person to say that to me.
Oh, really? I'm 1971. So I reading it, I was just in the, I know what this really is. But, I mean, it's great in and of itself. But what it really feels like is those of us who had rotary phones and the inability to find out anything instantaneously. But yeah, I did like the again, maybe the retro influence of old style flip phones. I will say in my day job, working as a lobbyist in the pharmaceutical industry, I interact with congressional staff, but also see Congress people and senators. The actual elected officials all use flip phones.
Really?
Yeah, I assume it's because they're not hackable. They maybe have iPhones, they also do, but there are older ones. I sit on a train down to D.C. and I look at this representative and he's got 2 flip phones on his tray and that's it. So sometimes it's Jurassic technology, but it serves a purpose, I guess, at least for security.
You do hear of people that prefer what they call dumb phones, to smartphones, and I can kind of get that. It's nice to get away from things sometimes, isn't it?
And still have the option to at least call someone if you're being kidnapped. But yeah,
I went to Central London yesterday because we did a launch in Gosh Comics in Soho, and I haven't been on a train since before the pandemic, and it's crammed full of people, and it's just, I mean, Central London's full of crowds walking into each other, 30, 40 years ago. But now you just need 1 or 2 people just gazing at their phones whilst they're doing it, which I find amazing. Even, phones have been around for like 20 odd years, and I'm still flabbergasted that people walk around in a busy crowd with traffic
just like zombies
staring at them.
Laniers, the Argentine cartoonist, had a great Night of the Living Dead gag strip that was just a whole bunch of zombies holding their phones exactly like they were when they were alive. Yeah. And they're just shambling by. Yeah. And the light is shining up in their faces. Yeah. But that takes us away from the book itself. The question I have, or one of many questions, you mentioned finishing in 2021. First, how much of the book had you written before beginning? Or how much did it evolve over the course of those 6 or 7 years?
Well, it evolved quite a bit, I guess. I didn't know how it was going to finish, but because it was originally serialized in Aces Weekly, and they run 21 pages over 7 weeks, if that makes sense, and then you have a break.
Yeah, I interviewed David years ago, and he made it sound like it worked, but it was his birthday, and he was drinking a lot that day.
Was he? I've only spoken to him once.
Yeah, we had the single longest interview David has ever had that nobody mentioned V for Vendetta. We went over 2 hours before I got around to mentioning that. And he was like, I don't think I've ever had a conversation that went this long without somebody bringing it up. I was like, yeah, I kind of figured you deserved everything else. Let's talk about the rest of your career. But,
Well, my view is he's David Lloyd. And I remember stuff that he did before V for Vendetta I don't know if you're familiar with stuff that he might have done for Marvel UK. In the sort of late 70s, like Night Raven and Doctor Who backup strips. And I always loved his artwork then. And then, obviously, V for Vendetta is seminal, I suppose. And so getting my strip in Aces Weekly was thrilling. And also it meant I wasn't self-publishing it and losing money. I was, not just breaking even, but getting maybe £100 for 21 pages, which in small presses feels unheard of. So, so I think I was not so subconsciously, but the book doesn't break down into 21-page units, but it helped me to take the approach of, well, in this 21 pages, I need to move the characters from this position to that position and do it in an entertaining way so that, I can't have them all stuck in the house for however many pages. I think it's easier. When I did There's No Time Like the Present before, I didn't know how long that was going to be, but I had a good idea of what the story was, but I knew that I couldn't work out the detail because it was going to take me 8 years to draw and I would be bored really quickly. And if I needed lots of space for spontaneity. But I had what I think of as junction points in the story where I knew I had to get the characters to and establish certain things before moving on to the next junction point. With Why Don't You Love Me, I knew it was going to be 210 pages, and that was kind of dictated by its association with Aces Weekly. They didn't dictate it. I had decided upon that. But there were kind of junction points in the stories where I was story to move the characters from space, point A to point B. But really, I was working on making the single pages also entertaining and working on their own terms as they are presented as fake Sunday comic strips. So that meant that I could languish in areas that I might not otherwise have spent time in, but then also had to be disciplined in other areas because it meant having to get a move on with certain things. And yeah, I enjoyed working that way a lot. It feels a bit like seat of your pants writing, if you know what I mean. You know, sure. Will I establish all this thing in a way it doesn't appear rushed? It just works still. And I enjoyed that process very much.
Yeah, it's remarkable to have that length of a book in this style, done knowing that it was done serially. So it's not, one of those, I sat around for 3 years writing and then got to the drawing. The idea that it was, coming out in process like this, but has such unity to it. Well, again, you've heard other people praise it, but yeah, it is a remarkable book to really take in its entirety, which was 2 sittings for me. I started it one night and thought, okay, well, I'll get to this tomorrow. And then the next day it was just 3 hours on the sofa, just reading and having my heart rent a bit and taken into some interesting directions. Our whole thing is to not discuss what everybody discusses, which is twists / spoilers for this. But yeah, it's a remarkable achievement of a book. So
thank you. I've made it difficult for people to talk about and to review.
I know.
Well, I didn't imagine this situation would ever occur. Do you know what I mean?
So, who's ever going to read my book? I don't need to worry.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's going to be sent out and disappear, into vapor. And yes, so and
then you end up getting a blurb from Neil Gaiman that strongly implies there's this amazing twist in the middle and doesn't want to say what it is. And of course, his name is going to bring a lot of people to it. So, so that's got to be good and difficult for you at the same time.
Well, no, not really. I mean, I don't really, it is what it is, isn't it? It's a weird relationship because I don't want it to be spoiled for people. I want people to discover it and take from it, whatever it is they feel it is to them. But equally, I don't want to undermine that by saying, this happens and this happens, and actually it's about this, that, and the other. But
yeah, we'll let it unfold. I mean, to me, I'll instead draw corollaries to it by saying it reminded me significantly of going into another medium, Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads. This is not my beautiful house.
Oh yeah,
this is not my beautiful wife. That sense of wait a second, I'm in the middle of this life and I don't know. There are reasons that some of the characters don't know what's going on in their world, but you and I are near the same age, and I think there's a degree of the midlife thing where wait a second, how the hell did I end up in this role? And I'm responsible for what? And making that material as you did is just. Well, again, as a 52-year-old man, it captured a lot for me.
Well, I don't have children. I'm not married, and
same here. So
right. Well, it's not. I guess it is a decision, but I haven't. It's not really a decision. It's a combination of the two things. I don't know. Remember, I always thought we don't live in a particularly nice enough world to bring kids into it. but I could also imagine if things were easier for me conceiving children and going, oh, well, I do like them. Do you know what I mean? And so...
My wife and I had we didn't like kids when we were kids. So, yeah, I remember, not so much.
I had a relationship with someone who has, for a while, who has 2 children. I keep in touch with them. And one of them still remembers me saying to them about 12 years ago, when they were about 8 or 7, I said, I've never liked teenagers, especially when I was a teenager. So I think I
felt a great deal of sympathy towards you.
I foreshadowed his teenage experience for him. But yes, it's funny you should mention that record, because I bought a record player whilst, by coincidence, working on Why Don't You Love Me. I cracked eventually. I was trying to stick with CDs, and I was one of the last people amongst my friendship group to crack and go back to vinyl. And I went onto eBay, and I thought, well, I'll try and grab all these 7-inches I used to own. And one of them was Once in a Lifetime. It's a great record. It's that
one of my all-time favorites. But
I thought Heads I thought they peaked with that. I guess there's lots of Talking Heads fans that will get cross with me over that statement. But it's such an amazing single.
Yeah, still hoping to get David Byrne on the show someday, but that's a forlorn hope. So chances are he won't listen to this one, so we'll be okay. But the thing I'm curious with, when we talk about the story evolving and developing over that time, it runs into your timeline runs into the pandemic. You're finishing it in the middle of lockdowns and everything else that we're going through. Did you find that influencing the story, or the greater world, either the characters are living in, or the worldview you were framing throughout it?
Well, I think most of it was finished by the time the pandemic had started. So I think 90% of it had been written and drawn, and it was only it was kind of interesting from my perspective that an event that had happened earlier in the story, I felt like I'd guessed our behaviour quite correctly, which I don't think I really got anything wrong. I think I was a bit reserved, if anything. But then when I got to revisit it, I made purposeful references to things that happened in the pandemic, like the shortages of toilet roll, and I enjoyed using a couple of rubbish jokes to facilitate to counter all the awful stuff that was happening. But yes, the pandemic. It's not about the I don't feel it's about the pandemic, given that most of it was completed by the time the pandemic happened.
Sure. I just didn't know if that last 10% perhaps was darkened in any way or otherwise, affected by what we were going through. Well,
I think by the time I got there, that 10% was pretty much going to be what it was. It turned out to be. I think by the time I got to the start of that 10%, I knew. Actually, I didn't know about how it was going to end exactly. I think I had a brainwave about 10 pages away from it. That kind of this is the perfect ending, and so I was very pleased with that. But as I said to you before, if I'm going to do a long project, you can't work out every detail, otherwise you won't finish it, or I won't finish it. But and I like to have space for spontaneity. I pretty much knew what I was doing in that final 10% by the time I came to do it.
Do you feel you grew as an artist, or as a cartoonist, we'll say, just in terms of visual storytelling, writing, over the course of the book?
Yeah. I really purposefully wanted the original art to look as close to what was going to be printed. So I keep referring to my previous graphic novel, There's No Time at the Present. I mean, that was all drawn on paper, but I didn't. I drew on scraps of paper and assembled it in Photoshop, and the earlier pages featured me cheating a bit and copying panels and then scanning in different bits for those panels. But by the second half of that book, I realised I enjoyed drawing these things more and repeating myself. And if I had slow movement between panels, found that I was happier redrawing those things than doing that cheat I'd previously done. But also in that book, I started off drawing on printer paper, and it wasn't until the second half I thought maybe I ought to spend some money on Bristol paper,
The line is different over the course of that book. Your line changes, I forget what point, maybe 100, 150 pages in or so. It feels like not a different artist, but an artist who's got a different sense of line.
I felt a lot more confident and happier doing it. And I do remember a point in that book that's maybe around that. So it's interesting that you note that. Yeah. So when I came to drawing Why Don't You Love Me, I wanted all the artwork to look the original artwork to look as good as possible, and not for me to kind of fix it apart from tidying it up when you scan it, in anything else. So yes, I felt that that's something I'm pretty pleased with, because I like the idea of the artwork being exhibited one day, and someone going into a room and it's all on the wall and they don't know where to start reading it. Reading it and seeing how they interact with it, and you can't really do that if it doesn't exist physically, I guess.
Yeah. Have you? Well, do you prefer working on paper, or do you do much work on computer directly?
Well, my next thing, which I've been working on since the last year or two, is all on. I've been using Procreate on the iPad to do it, and I really love it. Because there's no scanning in and tidying up artwork, which is a part of the process I would despise. So, yes, that is good. But then for the signing I did in Gosh yesterday, I did lots of sketch cards, lots of drawings to be given away with the books. And I loved drawing on paper again, which I hadn't done for a little while. I mean, I dabbled, but not with that sort of purposeful focus. And so I need to think of a project I can do on the side that allows me to draw. I thought maybe I'd forgotten how to do it, but I didn't feel that I had. So,
yeah, that muscle memory thing just comes back.
Yeah. But I was enjoying getting messy with inks and knowing
the smudge.
Yeah.
I'm left-handed, so everything is a smudge when I'm trying to draw.
Well, sometimes you see comic artists drawing, and they do things that I don't do. Like on a YouTube video, for example, and they'll rest on a sheet of paper on top of the artwork, so they're not smudging stuff. Oh, that's how they don't smudge the artwork.
I had to figure this out. I do a postcard a day thing, and I eventually had to figure out to use a micron that wasn't water soluble, because the pen I was using prior to that, I would always have to slide a piece of paper, under my hand on top of the postcard just to keep from smearing everything. But yeah, it's other people have figured out tricks of the trade a lot earlier.
Yes. Yeah, I know. It's when you're shocking when you get to your 50s and you realise you haven't known this thing that other people have known for decades.
Yeah.
That's why they earn a living from it, probably.
Once again, we grew up before YouTube,
yes.
So it wouldn't occur to us to look for these things necessarily. But where did comics begin for you?
Well, I was a big Planet of the Apes fan when I was. Remember the TV show?
Oh yeah, I forgot the memoir strips, which I'll also ask about.
Oh right, okay, yeah. So, yeah. Well, the memoir story you're talking to isn't entirely truthful, but it was a Planet of the Apes TV show I enjoyed very much. And in the memoir strip you're referring to, my aunt gives me a Planet of the Apes comic and says, there you go, enjoy this, and ruins my life. But in reality, what happened was my parents allowed me to stay up late and watch it. Normally, you go to bed 8 o'clock on a school night, but the show didn't finish till 8:15. But they said, look, we're not going to send you to bed on this occasion. You can watch Planet of the Apes. Yes, you love it so much. And one day, and that was it. And then just one Saturday morning, I saw an advert on TV for a new Planet of the Apes comic, because they used to advertise comics on television in those days, new comics. And I didn't rush down to the newsagents and buy it, but I saw it in a newsagents maybe 2 or 3 weeks later and started buying that. Marvel UK there's a Marvel UK which would reprint American comics in black and white over here. And those comics would be published weekly, and they would break up the American comics into smaller chunks. So that comic I bought had Planet of the Apes in it. Maybe, I can't remember, like one of these sort of Marvel science fiction-y strips from maybe one of their magazines at the time in America. And it had Kazar, drawn by Jack Kirby, as well in it. So, yeah. And Marvel, even then, when they weren't doing events so much, were very good at persuading you to engage with the rest of their comics. So they'd have editorials that say, if you like Planet of the Apes, then you'll love Spider-Man. Do you know what I mean? And being 7, you just go, well, that must be true.
Yes, I will.
Yeah. I will conform. And it just sort of rolled from there, really.
And in terms of starting to make your own?
I always, I think my dad used to bring home from work that sort of computer printout paper. That's correct.
With the holes in the sides and the perforation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it felt, because they were connected by those perforations, it felt like I could draw. They were kind of ready-made comics that I just needed to get to draw, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So I remember drawing on those, that a lot. Then I think the first photocopied thing I did was with a friend called Robert Patrick, called Clone. We did a strip together called Atom Squad, I think it was. Yeah. And then we did loads of fan art of our favourite comic characters. And then this guy who was in charge of the photocopier at school, who was a member of staff, ran off about 10 copies each for us. And then we didn't know what to do with them, so they just sat in our bedrooms until eventually getting thrown away. But and then when I was in my teens, a friend of mine, Robert Lewis, approached me and said he wanted to put together a local fanzine about local bands and arts, and asked me if I do comic strips for it. So I got involved with that, and then in my 20s, I always wanted to be a comic writer and artist, but I've no idea how you go about approaching publishers and getting taken seriously. I've never understood that, even though I've only started to have some success more recently. So I took the decision that I'm just going to write and draw and do my own thing. And so I've been self-publishing my comics since probably the mid-90s. So I had Memory Man, ran for 6 issues, which was, I persuaded Diamond distributors to carry. And you know what dealing with comic shops is like. The peak order is always going to be issue 1. And then every order after that for subsequent issues is going to be less. And so when I got when Diamond agreed to cover to carry it, I took the view that this is it. I just need orders for like 4,000 and I can live on this. Brilliant. and I got orders for like 190. and then you just know the orders for second issue were going to be like 140 if you were lucky, and it was just downhill. So that was a bit of a wake-up call. So I did a comic called Love Bomb, and in the 2000s, early 2000s, I sort of regrouped myself and put stuff on the internet and ran stuff off on photocopiers rather than going to proper printers. And then about 2005, maybe, I started work on There's No Time Like the Present, which I serialised over about 13 separate issues before Escape Books published a collection. And then, always self-published. I'm happy not to, though. Now I've got a bit of interest from Drawn and Quarterly and get comic strips in Viz over here. I'm enjoying that at the moment. I'm a bit sick of boxes of unsold comics being, stacked around the house.
I was a small press publisher over 20 years ago and a book publisher. But coming home every day from work and just seeing the boxes and boxes, it was just a little disheartening.
Well, did you publish this way with your own work, Gil, or was it?
No. I'm a failed writer, which everybody criticizes me for saying, but really, I am. And so I published books by Samuel Delany, a science fiction writer, Paul West, this literary writer, and a guy who first connected me to this world, Vince Ches, who was a not well-known literary writer. So I did about 5 or 6 books over 6 years and had I'm going to run myself into the ground doing this. And so I gave up on that, started blogging 20 years ago tomorrow, according to my calendar. And because I keep the anniversary of when I started blogging, and then started the podcast in 2012. And that's it made me realize that's my milieu. Conversation on a weekly basis is a lot better than actually sitting down and writing something.
Yeah. Well, the thing about self-publishing is when you first get it back from the printer and you see the object, you go, and then you can't imagine that 2, 5, 10 years later you'll be sick of the sight of this thing. Well, actually, it's also quite true. I'm very happy with what I've done over the years, and I'm certainly the last 15 years, I'm much better at not having that issue of boxes and boxes around the place, because especially as printing's so affordable these days, you can
second printing isn't an issue if things run out.
Exactly.
But I can imagine. But
I'm not trying to talk you back into doing it again.
No, I did a zine at the beginning of the pandemic. It was all prose, and I've got most of the second issue done. It's going to be almost 3 years by the time I send out another one. So I always joke that John Porcellino has nothing to worry about. I'm not going to catch up with him at any point. So. But that's I'll if I do I only have 1 copy left of the original run, so if I do a second run, I'll mail you a copy after this. But when it comes to now that you worked with a publisher, are you still in the serialization production mindset, or do you think about hey, it'd be nice to get in advance, go hide and write and draw, an extended stretch before things start, again, serializing and becoming public in process?
Well, the thing I'm working on now, I've not really been sharing. I've been sharing clips of it, bits and pieces, but I'm not been sharing it otherwise. It feels disingenuous to Drawn and Quarterly to talk too much about the next thing when really Why Don't You Love Me still live. So
do you know what I mean? I always fear jinxing creators by saying, so what's coming next, when they're 2 weeks into publication.
No, I'm more than happy to talk about it because obviously I'm excited about it, and but I'm still excited and in love with Why Don't You Love Me. So But
what's it like seeing the response like this?
Yeah.
Getting the Guardian praise and things like that. How has that been for you?
Yeah, I can't process it. I really can't. It's like, because you're self-publishing, you just get ignored in the main, or releasing it online. You live for life.
Everything disappears.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily always get very many of those. So the last few weeks, I'm trying to make sure I just not think about it too much. But I find I've still got that self-publishing mentality of having to tell everyone about a good review. Do you know what I mean? Because, but then I forget I need to let Drawn and Quarterly do that. So I'm sort of finding myself a bit in this new scenario, but it's not everlasting, is it? I mean, it's going to be over in.
That's what I was saying. Well, I was going to say, when you were talking about like downplaying it to yourself, don't necessarily do that. Enjoy this.
Oh no,
because
we had a lovely launch yesterday, and I was sent photographs that were taken during the signing, and it's just everyone's smiling. And the people that came along were a sort of mixture of friends, people I hadn't seen for years, and new faces, and that friends and people I hadn't seen for years all seemed very happy for me, and so did the new people. So I'm allowing myself to enjoy it, but I'm still processing the idea that I might actually be better than I'd previously thought I was. Well, I believed I was, and everyone else was wrong.
Of course, that was the title of Wayne White's first book of art. Now I'll get the recognition I so rightfully deserve.
Yeah, but I don't like it. Well, I do like it. I'm worried I like it too much. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
Understood.
Yeah, but I said when I talk to my family, none of my family really don't give the impression that they understand what it is I'm experiencing. And if I was talking to my mum about it, and I was trying to explain how confusing it is to me, and she said, "Well, just I thought you said you weren't going to let it go to your head unless you get more money." I said, "Yeah." I said, "That is the measure. If there's more money, but beyond the advance,
right." Well, that the Kate Beaton on her Patreon feed has a series of comics of her parents busting her balls about her new book, which is an unqualified success, and it's on Obama's book list and everything. But
it's a great book
she's
as
just
well. I
running
read it over Christmas, in one sitting pretty much. It's terrific.
Yeah, but her strips are basically her parents busting on her for, not even I'm on the New York Times bestseller list. Oh, but look at the book ahead of her on the list. Yeah. Like they're just willing to goof on her again and again over this.
Well, her parents are more interested. My parents wouldn't even understand what a New York Times bestseller list is. And it's not meant I'm not insulting my parents. My parents are lovely, and supportive. It's just not something that, enters their sphere of experience, I guess.
Understood. Were they, when you say supportive, like, were they supportive of your comics growing up or interest in making art? And you can say no, they're not listening, so it's okay.
Well, I'm one of 6 children, so I've got all sorts of I'm kind of...
The attention deficit was going in the other direction.
Exactly. And I mentioned this to my mum the other day, because my next project is a kind of part memoir about my school days, and I'm going to have to refer to this idea of me not getting the attention I feel that I deserve, seeking attention. And I mentioned this to my mum, and she said, "You got all the attention you needed," like this, really defensively. But I said, "Look, it wasn't meant as a criticism. I was one of 6 children. I mean, objectively, we're all going to be competing.
That's 16% of the attention a single child would have gotten.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or we're all going to be competing with each other for attention we think we don't get. Do you know what I mean? That's all I mean. Yeah. So, I forgot where we started with that. But
but yeah, just growing up, were they okay with you doing comics, or was there a we'll say supportive versus not actively destroying your interest in them? So.
Well, there was a family do. I always remember this, and I feel a bit cruel saying this publicly, but hopefully it won't.
No one's listening.
It was one sort of Boxing Day, and we were all, everyone's adults have been drinking, and I was probably about 11 or 12. And I think my grandma said, "What does Paul want to do when he grows up?" And my mum said he wants to be a comic artist. And my grandmother said, "Yes, but what's he want to do when he grows up?" And I remember that so vividly. And of course, when you're 15 or 16 and you say that to your parents, and they say, "Oh, well, that's fine, but make sure you've got all the proper qualifications, for a real job,
Yeah, fallback.
Yeah, but they were absolutely right, of course. Absolutely right. Mm-hmm. If they'd have said, "Go for it," I wouldn't have been good enough at 18 or 25, or I don't have that. I feel I do, but I don't really have that objective commercial mindset. If I were to sit down and think, "Oh, I'm going to send a strip to 2000 AD," what is it 2000 AD wants? I can't do what they actually want. I do what I feel they should want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I'm with you completely. I've had the same thing of, this pitch is absolutely perfect. Not for this venue whatsoever, but if it was a general interest magazine of me, this would be great. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to what we were saying earlier. I didn't quite get to finish when we were talking about the next project and why I was not revealing it in portions or sections. At the moment, it's really because I feel I want to give "Why Don't You Love Me" every opportunity to succeed. So I want to give it, 6 months either side at least to, be the best it can be, I suppose. So I'm holding on to this, and I would like the idea of maybe everything I've done has been appeared before the book version or the collected version. I'd like this to just appear one day. And
that's what I was wondering, whether that interests you, the idea of, for some writers and artists I've talked with, they need the serialization, like that recurring deadline thing. I'm projecting here because I do this every week along with a couple of other, recurring things in my life. But that sense that, if they didn't have the deadline, it would be a lot tougher to do. But it sounds like you're in a place where, having done that and proven it to yourself for so many years, this, just sit down and do it and not have to feed it out in drips and drabs is actually, something you're into right now.
Well, the advantage of releasing it in dribs and drabs is you do kind of get some feedback, and those little boosts are often what you may need to continue with this big, ambitious project. And anything beyond 4 pages, when you're not being paid for it, it feels like a big, ambitious project, So, my circumstances might change. I might have to get a day job again. And if that were to happen, then I might reconsider and think, well, I will release this in bits because people engaging with it will motivate me to continue with it, even if my rate of production has dramatically dropped, So, but at the moment, I would love for it to appear as a finished thing. I've only shown it to, I've got an agent, believe it or not. I've shown it to my agent, and we had a little discussion about it. And I think we both I said, I'd like to get a bit more of it done before it gets shown to people. And I don't know, an agent is relatively new to me, so I don't know what the etiquette is regarding showing publishers something that's partially done, especially I don't really know what a lot of it's going to be yet.
Sure.
And I keep going on about a project that doesn't exist yet from your perspective.
It's okay.
But I'm not doing it.
Because we'll be on in a couple of years. We were going to sit down in a couple of years again, and it'll be, wow, that book was not what I was describing to you. But I just, the first episode of the year was like that because it was somebody who hadn't been on in 7 years on the show. She was describing the book that she was now on to talk about. And 7 years ago, it was a very, very different description of a book that she was writing a piece of fiction. And I said, Sarah, back in 2016, you said, she's like, really? I guess that's what the book was going to be back then. But no, it became something very different.
Yeah. But also, I'm starting to feel slightly guilty about just talking about things other than Why Don't You Love Me? But it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning.
I know.
My tendency is to avoid talking about it too much because I don't want to give any of it away.
So what I'll ask is how much of the domestic dysfunction came from life? Well, we'll just put it that way. You have two parents who are really unsuited to raise the children in the first half of the book, and the relationship between them and the deterioration is terrible and hysterically funny, which I know is a very difficult balance to achieve. How much pure imagination and how much either experience or stories you just sort of exaggerated from friends and other people in your life.
That dysfunction stuff was imagination, really. I just
don't throw your parents under the bus.
No. My parents weren't like that at all. No, it was once I understood I knew what the conceit was from the beginning, and I knew going into it that I was not going to do it for because I don't think the conceit. Not wanting to say what the simple conceit was. To spoil it, I don't think the conceit is particularly original. I think I just decided I didn't want to do a popularist sort of Hollywood comedy version of this conceit. I wanted just to run with the logic of it. And once I had in my mind how this conceit happened, I felt I had to be true to it, and it meant having these characters behave in ways that, from the point of view of the reader and my point of view, were awful. And I think there's a bit of bait and switching going on, where it implied it's one thing perhaps early on, as Neil Gaiman describes it, a narcissistic cartoonist's, view of.
I've got his quote here. I've got the book in front of me. I thought it read like any number of slightly surrealistic, slightly vapid early 2000s stories that were basically the cartoonist's way of telling you they hated everyone and everything. And then it came into focus, and it wasn't that thing at all. And then it came into focus again, uplifting and heartbreaking and, a word that I use sparingly, relevant. There's more to it, but yeah, that captured it completely. For me, it was the 90s indie comics, because there was a run of cartoonists who basically all did comics about artists who had a crush on the girl at the coffee shop and didn't know how to talk to her. And you realized a lot of it was just really coming from life. But I think Neil nails it with that 2000s vibe where things got a little more absurd and weird. Yeah.
There's a lot of people who seem to be understandably influenced by, I guess, that sort of Chester Brown and Joe Matt and Seth sort of set of well, it's more Chester Brown and Joe, well, probably more Joe Matt, I guess, but we're finding their unique own voices, I guess. That was a rubbish thing I just said. I didn't explain that at all well.
No, I think it was. Well, the three of them established that autobio mode really strongly, and I think Joe's was the easiest for a less talented person to access and ape.
Mm.
If that's it, like, Joe's sort of revelation thing was, I can do something like that. Other people could dive into that, where Chester's were so layered and difficult, and Seth's, just the artistry of it all became very difficult for anyone to try to, sort of access. But yeah, those are exactly the three guys who set that tone in the early 90s, for sure.
With Joe's stuff, I mean, I loved it all. Joe's stuff was really funny, and Seth's stuff, I think, it's a good life if you don't weaken. I haven't read that for such a long time, so I can't remember the details. But I took that to be an autobiographical story. It turned out not to be, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, that was the great reveal.
Yeah,
that was, oh my God, the whole thing's fiction.
And I sort of like that. And I think even Joe Matt did that, where there was this real big scene in one of his issues. I think it was an orgy scene or something that I thought it was revealed much later on not to have actually happened. Or something, which is a big deal in the comic because it's obviously all he ever wanted. Whereas, you're right, Chester Brown's stuff is altogether
on another planet. Yeah. It's the most difficult to say, "Oh, I'm going to do something like Chester Brown." That doesn't fly.
He's so naturalistic as well, isn't he? And he makes it appear effortless. And they haven't done a collection of all those Bible stories he drew.
He did one of just he did 2 new Bible stories as a book, but I don't think they ever collected.
No, I think the original stuff from Yummy Fur. So I've been trying to get all these missing issues just so I can say I've got them, and I'm not having any luck whatsoever. I mean, eBay's not sending.
You live in an eBay world. You should be able to get all this stuff somehow.
Yeah.
But, worst comes to it, I'll go through my long boxes back in the storeroom and let you know what I've got here in case there's anything I can help you with.
Oh, well, thanks. Thank you. You're very useful, Gil.
I'm of a certain age where I realize those comics are sitting in long boxes back in the boiler room, and it's like, there's a whole bunch there. It's great that I own, but I'm never going to dig up and read. And I've recorded with Chester a few times now, which have been exceedingly strange conversations up in Toronto during the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. But I'll take a look and see if I've got anything that works for you.
Oh, thanks. Do you not go through your comic collection and just pull out loads of stuff and get rid of it every now and then, which is what I tend to do?
No, I did it years and years ago, like decades ago. And what's left is what I considered to be important, but that also includes like 120 reprint issues of Cerebus.
Really?
Come on.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Like, I didn't throw them out in 2000, but why am I holding on to these?
Yeah.
So, somebody I will not be interviewing up in Canada at any point. But tell me, when you mentioned those guys, who were the sort of the cartooning influences for you?
Oh, definitely those.
Were there artists you?
I when I was a kid, it would have been Kirby, Ditko. I guess we had advantages in Britain because of reprints that this stuff was probably over in America in the 70s. You weren't seeing. Oh, Kirby was still drawing and Ditko, but that sort of.
It wasn't the golden age of either one of them.
No. Yeah. So we were getting like an intense Marvel hit, I guess, because of the rate at which this stuff was being reprinted for us. I loved a lot of 2000 AD artists. I remember trying to copy Mike Mahan's artwork when he was around the time he was drawing Judge Dredd and Slain. I think I find I've read a lot of comics and I read a lot of comics, so I'm always trying to learn something from what I can see on the see happening on the page. But those artists. I also think Eddie Campbell was a big influence.
I was assuming, but didn't want to name him before you did, because
Paul Gravett, who is the publisher or was the publisher at Escape Books, did Escape magazine in the 80s, and that was a period of revelation for me. And and I loved Eddie Campbell's stuff from there, and I've still got all those collections that Escape published, these kind of slim volumes.
The Alec books from the original ones.
Eddie Campbell's great, and obviously Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez. Yeah, just brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And
your science
and Dan Clowes.
Yeah. We've got the same pantheon. That's good.
Pardon? Yeah,
we have the same pantheon. Yeah. That's good.
I was also Craig Thompson. Is it Craig who did Blankets?
Yeah.
And he's good, isn't he? I don't like to mention people younger than me, but yeah, he's.
I don't interview people younger than me because I feel like a failure. But
yeah, your pool of interviewees is diminishing fast, isn't it?
Hey, I sat down with an 88-year-old illustrator yesterday. That was Jim McMullen here in New York City, or nearby in New York. I was like, let me just sit down with this guy because, he came up with Milton Glaser and Seymour Quast and all these great illustrators at Pushpin Studios. And I thought, I should make sure we get a nice conversation in. But yeah, younger, no, not so much. No. But beyond the comics, tell me about your sort of science fiction upbringing, because you SF permeates your work, and it's not just the pop cult, Star Wars science fiction. Were you a big science fiction reader as a kid, or is it something that sort of permeated through the comics?
I think it's through comics, really. So, I like Philip K. Dick stuff when I was younger, and a big 2000 AD reader, which has a bit more of a pop science fiction sensibility, I think, certainly when I was reading it in its first 10 years. So, and I like a good science fiction idea, I think, but I'm also quite lazy and unwilling to do any research. So I think that's why I bolt it onto a kitchen sink type environment, because I understand that. I think the best comics are. I mean, I was going to say your science fiction concepts work in this one. They work in the last one. I'm impressed with the execution of them. Thank you. I think science fiction conceits are kind of quite culturally everywhere, aren't they? Really, even if it's something as simple as Groundhog Day, that's potential. I haven't seen Groundhog Day, incidentally, but that's potentially a science fiction conceit where you live the same day over and over again. It's just, I guess, if I were doing it, I'd try and come up with a science fiction-y, a kind of pseudo physics explanation as to why that day is being relived over and over again, and then run with it to the ultimate extreme. I've never seen Groundhog Day. Oh, Groundhog Day is good. There's a movie came out a few years ago called Palm Springs, which is a Groundhog Day scenario, but does exactly what you're saying. Like, they try to figure out what quantum thing has happened that is causing people to relive this one day. It was on Hulu. It's one of the streaming services. So, but yeah, you may dig that one just because Groundhog Day has become so prevalent as a mode. I guess this at least takes it in another direction. But that idea of reliving the same thing over and over again isn't particularly original, is it? Even around Groundhog's Day's time of release. Sure. There was a short film I saw. Stars the guy who played Clarence Boudica in the first RoboCop film. I can't remember his name. Where he lives the same hour over and over again. And I loved that so much. So when Groundhog Day came along 2 or 3 years later, I was so offended that I refused to watch it. And I've just never got round to watching it now. It's good. You'll be entertained someday. I'm the only. Kurtwood Smith is the actor. Yeah, definitely. It's only because the only good thing of doing these shows remotely is that I can look stuff up online instead of looking at the guest the whole time and talking. So, well, I should have done that and pretended I knew and come across as more knowledgeable. Because you're the genius of movie trivia. I'm not even bright enough to do a Google search whilst I'm talking to you.
But you're doing the one doing the heavy lifting in this conversation, so it's okay. But yeah, it's seeing how science fiction has permeated so much of the culture. I think of the everything everywhere all at once, the whole multiverse thing that people are really glomming onto, and what you do with that idea, is you take it in an interesting and neat direction. But one of the things I wanted to ask about Why Don't You Love Me was the meta move beyond, as we talked about the meta aspect of having old cell phones in your previous one, bringing back My Imaginary Band from your minis into this book, that sense of kind of touchstones of your past work showing up in this.
Yeah, I had when I was 50, I think I went through a bit of a meltdown in the year leading up to it, when I was 49, leading up to my 50th. And I think that's where that idea came from, because I always thought I should have been a pop star, even though I went bald at an absurdly young age. And I realised how absurd that daydream was, or that thought was. So I did like a couple of strips where me being a pop star didn't really work out particularly well. But I liked the idea. But I'm not a musician. I can't play a thing. But I have a bunch of songs in my head that I've written in my, melodies for. And obviously I've probably filled in. There's probably loads of gaps in these songs, but in my head, I don't feel that they've got those gaps. And I thought when I was about 49 or 50 that I know loads of musicians, people in bands, and have done for decades, that they could all get together and we could form a band. I mean, we could do these songs and pretend to be a reformed band that didn't previously exist. And that's where so that gets used in Why Don't You Love Me as well. I didn't. But yeah, hopefully I explained it well in that. It became... Oh
yeah, it stands alone just fine on its own within the book. It's just, seeing it in earlier shorts of yours, it's the question of sort of, doing the same thing, sort of making these callbacks to your own past in this new book.
I think because I made Mark a frustrated musician, or someone who had aspirations to be a professional musician, but it hadn't worked out for him, that it gave him it sort of added texture to him, I guess. I thought, to sort of use that and see, it enriched his backstory, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, the characters are full. It's one of those things you could easily have skated by and made them caricatures, but your leads live lives. It really is remarkable to read this book and to know how much office experience you must have based on
I never want to go back.
I
never want to go back.
Yeah,
it feels like one day.
It's been 9 years. I've been working out of my home for the last 9 years, and it's like, oh, thank God, I don't have meetings, I don't have reviews. Are you self-employed? I formed a trade association, and I run it, and I've got a board and all that, but I do everything myself and just report back to my board on a quarterly basis. So it's just
you don't have to have appraisals,
right?
I mean,
they go over and like, hey, did you? We have a strategic plan. Did you do all this stuff this year? And it's like, yeah, I did this and this and this.
It's not bullshit to avoid giving you a pay rise, is it?
No,
it's straight.
No, that's the whole thing.
Direct. You didn't do it.
Yeah, It's the realization. As I had to put it, before every board meeting, I get this anxiety for a couple of days, and usually, and it's all centered around my not remembering. This isn't like a regular workplace. They're here to help me succeed, not to hope I fail.
Yeah.
In other workplaces, it's all about how do we keep the budget and make sure somebody is the bottom ranked. Here, it's like, no, they actually want me to succeed. Okay, I got to get over,
So
30 years or 20 plus years in the business world.
The last job I had was, it's probably for the best organised company I'd worked for, but I lasted 6 months in it. It's because it was a big open plan office, and I I'd done everything by 9 o'clock in the morning, and there was nothing for me to do. And I'd say, I've got nothing to do. Have you got anything for me to do? Oh, we haven't at the moment. It's funny, isn't it? It's a bit quiet. They'd go. And because it's a big open plan office with people from other teams wandering around, it just makes you feel so kind of aware that you're not doing anything in this awful, neurotic way. And I feel like I could never go back to an office again, you know, just for that reason alone, that feeling of watching the clock tick backwards, you know. It's awful.
We will do our best to promote, you know, Why Don't You Love Me, and try to make sure this never happens to you again.
Yeah, that's why everyone listening to this should buy it.
Well, I was so happy when I was reading your updates from Gosh and places like that, talking about having to restock the book and just getting it back in time for the signing. I was like, it's a quality graphic novel that people are actually connecting to and going out and getting. So that's.
It's not just the reviews which have, you know, floored me. It's like lots of personal correspondences I've been getting from people saying how much they enjoy it and what they've been getting from it. And that's pretty flooring. And even people who don't consider themselves comic readers have contacted me and said, I don't normally read comics, but I thought this was, you know, I really enjoyed this, which is really what I've always kind of wanted to do, is to make comics for people who, not just comic readers, but people who don't read comics. People that think they don't like science fiction. Tricked you. I made you read a science fiction story.
Do you feel the visual conceit, or the panel conceit, the way every page starts with the logo, like it was a Sunday comic strip, do you feel like that gives that non-graphic novel reader a sense of familiarity or an entry point? Because when I first picked up the book, I didn't realize it was serialized first. I'm like, why is he doing the Why Don't You Love Me on each page, you know, as it begins? And you know, I understand now, you know, from the serialized side, but also even in collection, well, I wonder, do you think it gives, you know, a sort of entry point or a you know, ease of access to a non-hardcore comics reader?
I think it may do, because comics were far more ubiquitous 30 years ago. You remember, you know, they were far more common in newspapers and a part of our visual language, I guess. And Sunday comic strips would always have that. And what I thought when I was reading those Fantagraphics Peanuts collections was how you accept that big opening Peanuts logo. Do you know what I mean? And you go through it anyway. It doesn't. It's part of the landscape of the language. When it was originally serialized in Aces Weekly, they'd do 3 pages in an issue over 7 issues. So there'd be 3 pages that interlocked theoretically, but each would still have that logo. So I knew when I was doing it that I wasn't. It helps to break it down if you're on a big project as well, if you work on one panel at a time and 1 page at a time. But I wasn't thinking of it as I will serialize this as a weekly thing. Does that make sense? It was.
Yeah.
I'm
with you.
But I didn't. I thought it would be helpful in creating that sense of it having been a Sunday newspaper strip, even though it never was. Yeah. I don't ever want to draw those words again.
Yeah, that was my next question. How irritating did it become trying to come up with variety?
I kind of shudder at the thought of having to do it again.
Again, we all learn from our creative experiences. Exactly. It's the great one I I talked about on the show every so often. David Boswell, I heard in an interview, the guy who did Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman, back in the 80s.
I've got some of those.
Yeah, so do I. And that I would not give up, because those I will someday go back and reread. But would you do anything differently? He's like, well, if I knew I was going to draw him for 25 years, I wouldn't have given him that nose.
Yeah.
It's just that big box of a nose. He's like, that was impossible to draw at like any angle if I knew. Yeah, but
I think that's why Steve Ditko gave up Spider-Man after 3 years. He just realised he'd created a burden for himself. And
doing all the webbing.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't because of a disagreement over a story point. It was, I'm sick of drawing webbing.
There can be, more mundane reasons for a lot of these things. Yeah. But last question, which I tend to warn guests about. I didn't warn you this time, and I feel bad about it. But who are you reading, or what are you reading?
I've read art.
It could be comics or prose.
Oh well, it's comics. I've read Periwinkle Perspective, which is a novel by Paul Eccentric, which is a sort of steampunk alternative Victorian era history, which was really entertaining. I read Artists, which is a Drawn Quarterly book recently, which I enjoyed very much. And I read The Batman's Grave, which is a comic series by Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch, which I'm sick to death of Batman, I thought, but I quite enjoyed it. It was so... Batman's a bit overdone, isn't he? But they managed to get squeeze some fun stuff out of Batman. And I'm currently reading some Judge Dredd from, I think, the late 90s, maybe. There's I'm a big fan of John Wagner, who co-created Judge Dredd. I don't know how familiar you may or may not be with him, but he's such a great writer and so underestimated, in my view, by people that think or say they like comics. And I'm really enjoying those. But I've got quite a big to-read pile at the moment. Of stuff, I think, hang over from Christmas. Lots of stuff I'm looking forward to getting into. I've also got like a big pile of Spirit magazines. Will Eisner. I was really embarrassed about this, but slow on the Spirit. Which
we all have our gap. Ryan Hughes and I talked about this a couple of years ago. We all have. In my case, it was not getting Kirby when I was a kid, because I was coming up with the Claremont, Byrne, Austin X-Men, and that was sort of my visual mode. And Kirby, especially the new Kirby stuff in the 70s, late 70s, didn't work for me. And it took years later before I had he was a genius. Okay, no, I was missing it because I was a dumb kid. Oh, okay. So Will Eisner, I also had a big gap on before I finally got it in I guess, late teens, early 20s.
I had to confess to Paul Gravett yesterday that because he, in his Escape magazine, would run occasional Crazy Cat comic strips, and I resisted it, and then I just pushed back because everyone's telling me that it's the best thing ever. And then I think about last year I got a big huge not the Fantagraphics ones, although I mean to get those now, a big collection, a big hardback collection.
From Sunday Press.
I can't remember the name of the.
Yeah, Paul Maresca, Sunday. I think it's Sunday Press, has the big oversized, like the full sized,
it's huge
printings.
There was a sale or something, so I got it for quite affordably. It's brilliant. It's so good, and I feel so stupid.
There's things we're just not ready for, or we just have a hang up, and it's good we didn't read it then because we wouldn't have gotten it. But I know exactly where you're coming from.
Yeah, I think we should. That'd be an idea for a podcast where people confess the things they.
Trust me, this was the very first idea I had for the podcast back in 2012. It was called Secondhand Loves. Books or whatever that you hated when you were young that you came around on later. Not something you were assigned in school, but anything like this, exactly what we're talking about, the things you didn't get that turned out as you grew up to be so much better than you thought they would be.
Yes.
But maybe I'll reprise that,
Yeah. I think that's a good idea. It seems like an obvious idea, but you don't know how open people are to revealing that element of themselves.
Oh, I have no shame about how dumb my tastes were. Again, to me, the X-Men was the peak, but I was 8 or 9 years old. So, it's one thing when you carry that till you're 48 or 49 years old. To me, that's the weird thing. But
yeah, but it's all right taking pleasure in something and kind of. If you still enjoy those comics you bought at that time, it triggers nice memories in you. But if you're online getting angry about it and you're in your 50s,
that's what I mean.
For God's sake, mate. You're in your 50s and you're making YouTube videos, hours and hours of YouTube videos, ranting about something, superhero comic that's made you cross. It's a sign that superhero comics have failed if all they can do is evoke passion in 55-year-old men.
We'll see. Someday you'll be on the superhero beat. Yeah.
I hope so. I'll be up for it.
Hey, it'll keep you out of the office. That's important.
I'll do anything to avoid going back to the office.
Actually, that's my real last question. Were there people from your office life who recognize themselves in any of your strips, or do they either not encounter your strips or you haven't really incorporated them that obviously into your work?
I don't think so. Why Don't You Love Me? Claire's office experience is very much based on experiences I had, and but none of the characters are based on anyone in particular, if at all. The boss is a kind of amalgamation, if anything, of at least 3 people, with a quarter of just complete not anybody, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I'm glad, because that's somebody calling you pissed off that you use them in your book is probably not something you want to experience.
I did a diary strip called Book of Lists in the early 2000s, and partly to I liked drawing people I knew in it and showing them, and sharing it with them. It wasn't meant to be mean. I wasn't trying to go behind their back and make them feel bad about themselves. And I always remember this guy I worked with called Jonathan, who I showed it to, and he saw himself, and it was a joke, and he just went, "Thank you very much." He just didn't know how to respond. Not everyone does. I mean, how would I respond if someone did it to me?
I could imagine. Yeah. But all those people coming from Angoulême, they're all going to have their autobio strips and diary comics about seeing each other. So someday you'll be in that. Yeah. You'll be in that set, and my hair is no, you got it right.
See, I'm easy to draw. Because you got long hair, I see in the photograph.
It's pandemic life. I've grown it out for the last 3 years, and I look like Albrecht Dürer now, and it's. I will be honest. This is what we'll leave off on. When I was reading your similar to but not strip, I couldn't understand from the first panel how your character was the child of the other two. From the beginning, I'm like, wait, why is there a bald man in his 40s asking to go to the pub? And eventually I'm like, oh no, wait, okay, that's our prematurely bald protagonist.
So I thought. What happened in real life was I wasn't quite that bald, really, but I was going bald. And I always liked to wind my mum up because she always cut her hair when we were growing up. And one day when I was 15, she started laughing whilst cutting my hair. And I said, "What's so funny?" And she said, and these are her exact words, she said, "I can't believe that I am old enough to have a son go bald." And and I always say to her, "It's all about you, isn't it, mother?" And so I thought it would be a good sort of Paul Rainey universe thing to kind of do other memoir strips, self-contained short stories, where I eventually do tell that story. But And then, do you know what I mean? I thought I was foreshadowing a story at a later date that I haven't got round to drawing and may never get round to drawing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I just think you need to render yourself as like an 8-year-old balding too.
Yeah.
Just keep playing it younger and younger as the character gets,
there was
more in depth.
An Alexi Sales sketch. I don't know if you know, the British comedian.
Yeah.
And he did a sketch called Philip Larkin's a Poet. And then there was a show called The Darling Buds of May, which is a really cheerful show about a large family called the Larkins. And the sketch was this 8-year-old boy with a bald head, sitting at a table looking miserable, going, "They fuck you up, your parents." Just being really sour. And I thought, that's me as an 8-year-old.
Again, we'll see that in the book we're not going to talk about that comes after this. But, you and I hope we'll get to sit down in person next time. I get to England, well, pre-pandemic, I would go every year or two when I had a European business trip, but we'll see. My hope is we get to do this in person next time we talk,
love that.
Paul.
Yeah. So. And thanks for having me on, Gil. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thanks. And thank you for putting 7 years of your life into this book, because it really is a marvel.
Oh, cheers. Thank you.
And that was Paul B. Rainey. His new book is Why Don't You Love Me? From Drawn and Quarterly. I hope we got across some of what makes this such a special book, and I hope you go out and pick it up as soon as you can so that we can talk about it once you've read it and got, the big thing that happens in the middle. Anyway, Paul is on Twitter as PB Rainey, which is PBRAINEY, and on Instagram as pbrainey comics, all one word. His main site is pbrainey.blogspot.com, and his store, where you can get Why Don't You Love Me, along with lots of his previous and self-published work, including the great graphic novel There's No Time Like the Present, is at pbrainey.bigcartel.com. And I'll have links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one, including the link to the similar to but not short story he did about meeting Madonna in 1985, which is an absolute blast. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with really interesting conversation with writers and artists and other creative folk. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or music or piece of theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, DM, email, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go longer than that, it'll cut you off. Just call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the podcast. You might have something interesting to share with people, but I would never include something like that in the show without the permission of the speaker. So let me know. Now, if you want to support other people and institutions, don't support me. I mean, my job treats me just fine, although I haven't paid myself this year yet. I'm waiting for my compensation committee to get back to me to let me know what the 2023 raise is, and I don't want to pay myself before that and have to make it up like I did last year, which turns into an accounting nightmare. So I'm doing fine, is all I'm saying. The expenses for the show are pretty minimal, all things considered. But if you want to help other people in need, then go to GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, or other crowdfunding platforms. And you can find people who are in need of money for healthcare, for rent, for artistic projects they're trying to get off the ground, or other things that will, help them lead better or help them live better lives. when it comes to institutions in need, I give to my local food bank. I make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Fund or Poor People's Campaign. I give targeted election contributions. There are other things you can do, Planned Parenthood and Women's Choice funds, freedom funds. Well, there are a lot of places that you can give to try to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.